Good evening, everyone. As it is January 25th, 2021 at 6:02 p.m. We're here for a special board meeting, which is being held virtually. As permitted by Governor Pritzker's Executive Orders 2020-07 and 2020-33, the Oak Park and River Forest High School Board of Education, Cook County, Illinois, is convening a remote special board meeting this evening. Board members, citizens, and staff may participate in the meeting virtually. It is the link is on our website, and certainly this is being streamed live via YouTube. So we continue to operate under a disaster declaration related to the COVID-19 worldwide pandemic, and the health department continues to advise the community to practice social distancing, wear face masks, and avoid unnecessary contact with others. So based on these current public health concerns, I, as Sarah Spivey, as head of the public body, do not believe it is either practical or prudent to hold an in-person meeting of the Board of Education this evening. I further believe that it's not practical or prudent for the public to be present at our regular meeting place. We're going to continue to hold remote meetings with updated practices to comply with Public Act 101-640 that was signed by Governor Pritzker on June 12th of last year. Gail, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Kovsky?
Here.
Dr. Moore?
Here.
Mr. Barron?
Here.
Mr. Isley? Ms. Harris?
Here.
I don't know if Mr. Martiri joined us or not.
I see.
Yes, here.
Thank you.
I'm here. I'm having some technical difficulties tonight.
Okay.
A lot of them actually, but I'm actually here for now.
Thank you. Mr. Isley?
I don't see him.
Okay, and Ms. Dixon Spivey.
And I am here. Good evening,
Thank you.
everybody. It's lovely to see you all. Gail, do we have public comments this evening?
No, we do not.
Okay. All right. I think we can just get to it then. Ms. Graham-Washington, I am going to turn this over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for having me as well. And in the interest of time, we are going to jump back in as we too have a full agenda tonight. We're going to start by taking 8 to 10 minutes to just reflect back some of the feedback that informs why we're taking the course we're taking this evening by way of our learning. And then I'll spend 20 minutes perhaps on the distinctions around white supremacy and unpacking whiteness. We will then do a fishbowl strategy, asking some overarching questions as it pertains to the document that I shared with you prior to our meeting, the findings that came from your evaluative feedback. And then we will consider some tangible, practical application of that learning using the questions that came in that one-page document, and we'll close for the evening. Any questions about the agenda? It was also afforded to you in advance. All right, then let's hop right in. So some of the key elements that were clear when I reviewed your feedback is that over half of you received new learning in the last session, but there was a desire for the other half of you to move beyond a foundational level of learning about race. So there was more time needed for discussions amongst board members, and we certainly will accommodate for that this evening. More time for you to talk amongst yourselves and less time hearing from me about the information. But one of the things that I want to illuminate is that if half of the people on the call are receiving new learning, and then also their concerns about whether or not people will be comfortable and whether or not we can hold a safe space because we're concerned about who might be harmed in the process of the experience, it makes it very difficult to free up the space for conversations, because the more we do that, it increases the chances of the potential for the space not to be as comfortable and could potentially be challenging for some. So this is the tension that we have to manage in the work that we do. But I wanted to name that because it was being articulated from both directions in the feedback. There was some saw the value of having more vulnerability through storytelling and relationship building. Others wondered what those aspects of the workshop had to do with the work that the board has to accomplish. So again, when you have half the board having a deep desire for something like vulnerability, storytelling, relationship building in that particular way as it pertains to race specifically, and then the other half of the board saying, what I'm not getting the connection, it makes it, we have to get curious about how to hold all of that simultaneously. There were many people who said that we didn't have enough time and that we needed more time for a more holistic plan for anti-racism training. That was a sentiment that occurred multiple times in the feedback. There was a desire to discuss topics like white supremacy culture and how it works, intersections between race and policy and decision making. Again, these are difficult topics to address in such a short period of time, because when you're facilitating those conversations, you open up all this space for vulnerability. And if you leave things dangling, particularly for historically, intentionally, traditionally marginalized people group representatives, that can lead to harm. And so we have some perhaps decision-making about this tension where we have this deep desire to go deeper on topics of race, but these topics can't be unearthed and then put back within 1 to 2 hours. So that's something we'll have to get curious about better ways forward around. And then, and there were a couple of articulations that doing this work in a publicly shared forum is in and of itself an impediment to the work. There are elements of the work that can't be done in particular ways because of freedom of information and the public forum. For example, if I wanted to break you up into small groups and have you chat amongst yourselves, that's not possible because of the protocols that are in place. And so there was just a naming, and I think that's important, just to name some of the ways in which this forum for this particular kind of work can be challenging. So those were some of the findings and sharings that came from the evaluation. My impressions, I have 3. It's difficult to pin down a direction for the board to take regarding anti-racism training when the responses that would be best are as varied as they are between board members in terms of direction. So having a more consistent, succinct way forward by way of how we're prioritizing the work and the time we're willing to commit to it, and the context would be helpful. And I named that tension between people who don't feel trusting enough or safe enough to engage even more relationally than you have, and that's something that we might want to get curious about how to deepen. And I know that the board has been doing that work all along, but the feedback certainly pointed to a need to take that even further. And there needs to be a more proactive and intentional time spent on the development of a comprehensive plan for the board's training that includes personal development, like narrative sharing, posturing for equity, understanding whiteness and white supremacy, as well as professional development, use of the equity framework, intersections of race and policy making, et cetera. So the notion that we're holding both of these bookends in a 2-hour session on one of the most vulnerable topics that this country has experienced in 401 years, with one consultant to hold all of that at one time across only 2 sessions, that's a tough gig, friends. And so I just want to name that is a lot to hold, I think, for anyone, and to want to do the work in a way that's sustainable and pervasive.
Excuse me, I have a question, Ms. Graham-Washington. Can I ask a question?
Please.
One of the things that I mentioned in our last board meeting, I don't believe it was in this training, but it was in our last board meeting, is are there ways for us to do this work? And it was a Gail question, because she's all things OMA to me. Are there ways for us to do this work in potentially 2s and 3s that would not be in a public forum like this? So that not that you break us out while we're all together and once we've declared this space, but is it possible for, two of us to meet with you, or three of us to meet with, well, however many that number, magic number for OMA needs to be. Because the piece is the need for the relationship building and everything that you're saying. But also I'm aware that we have maybe how many more months before we have a new board? That there's going to be 4 new people. Oh, it could potentially be 4 people elected. It could potentially be 2 new people, right? So however it works out, we have the potential for there to be new people here, and we'll have a new team. And then that learning that we've done to get us and keep us moving forward and sustaining what the work is of the district. I want to throw that in there because I want us to be thinking about that, because it's I know the work is more long-term than that. So I just want us to be thinking about that, as well as how can we do some other things that might be in between. Not saying that everybody's got endless time, you know, I'm not saying that I do, but just throwing it out there.
Thanks, Gina. I like that idea. I think we could do it in 2s, right, Gail?
Yes.
2 is sort of the magic number. And one group of 1, I guess. One lonely person would have to do it by themselves, but we can figure that out.
I just wanted to add to this. One of the challenges, because this is something that has come up before about smaller groups and things like that, even with prior consultants. And, one of the issues is that it's not free. So we have to be willing to dedicate, our part of our board budget to that. And that has been a hindrance in the past. We haven't had consensus, I guess, on how we make these funds available to have smaller group work. So we've said before, oh, that's a great idea. And then when it's time, we have shied away for a variety of reasons. So I just want to make that, we have to make this put our money where our mouth is, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And as we're going into budgeting for next year, we can also bring this up in terms of how large we want that board budget to be specifically for this purpose. And Jackie, forgive me, I don't actually specifically remember turning down board training like that. I'm not saying we didn't, but it's not rising to the top of my memory right now. But I think that's certainly something we can do.
Oh, no, it's never been as direct as that, but it has been about kind of being shocked by the cost of having 2 facilitators at a meeting. And Ms. Graham Washington just pointed that out. That it's hard for one facilitator to do this. And also what it would mean to have smaller groups. It's been an issue of time, but it's also been an issue of resources and dedicating those resources. So it's never been out there kind of discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. That's a very valid point and something we should bring up again during our budget season, which is coming up.
Any other comments or questions as it pertains to the key elements or impressions from the last meeting and its data? All right, so if not, then I'm gonna take about the next 20 minutes and I am going to do some didactic training around this notion of what is white supremacy? What does it mean when we say it? And why is it so insightful in some instances? So I am a Black woman, and think of this, my hand here, as white supremacy, right? Or no, whiteness, just plain whiteness. It just is, as a social construct. And every day when I get up and start my day, I have to look at my being in correlation or relationship to this construct. So when I'm looking at this construct, I am not looking at it as a part of who I am, even though I absolutely participate in whiteness. I'm not looking at it as me and whiteness being one and the same. Whiteness is here, and Blackness is here, and I am here, down here, okay? So every day when I wake up, I have to think about my relationship to this and my relationship to this, okay? This notion of Blackness is informed by this idea or notion of whiteness. And because whiteness gets to say, majoritively speaking, what Blackness is, I now have to interrogate this definition that has been designed to define me. I have to say, I hear what they're saying about this. I will take this part. I will take that part. I will not take this because that is not true about who I am as a person. I have to interrogate this notion of Blackness to figure out what parts of it are mine and what parts of it are not, okay? So I can separate myself from Blackness to interrogate it pretty easily because some of the things about it are really not in line with who I know myself or my people to be, okay? Then I also have to do the same thing with whiteness, where I have to interrogate it and say, like any other culture or way of being, that I have to examine it. I have to gauge my participation in it. I have to figure out what of it I am willing to keep and what of it I am not. And the reason I can do this is because my life requires that my person is separate from the construct that has been handed to me called Blackness and the construct that has been in some ways handed to me and in some ways kept from me called whiteness, okay? Now, that's me as a Black woman. As a white person, everything about this thing called whiteness has only ever been deemed right and just and fair and the thing we want to achieve or aspire to. So this definition of Blackness, that is not the case. And that's why from the day I'm born, I interrogate and get curious about this way of being that's been prescribed. But this way of being has only ever been held up in our country and in our world as goodness and rightness and justness, right? And standard. And because of that, there has been very little reason for white people to interrogate whiteness. I will not question that which I believe is only ever good and right and best practice and standard and appropriate. So when I see myself and I see whiteness as the same, as opposed to mutually exclusive, it becomes almost impossible for me to get curious about what this is doing, why it's doing it, how it's doing it, who it's doing it to, and the impacts of it on myself or someone else. Okay? So tonight I want to extend an invitation that this is whiteness, just as a social construct. It's just a way of being that we can take on in the world to varying degrees. It is chock full of all kinds of things. And if I were going to give elements, I might talk about the way that time informs whiteness, the way that printed documents as the best way to learn anything, word-based documents is a part of whiteness. I might talk about the way that professionalism hails in this space. I might talk about how money is addressed and how it is not, and how all of those things are elements of whiteness. But as a person, what I'm inviting particularly the white people on the call to do is to extract yourself from the thing so that you can examine the thing. And take a look at this thing from a curious and interrogating perspective. What is this thing? How does it operate in the world? Who is it impacting positively, negatively? Why is it being upheld, and to what extent, right? This is just whiteness. Well, here we have blackness, we have brownness, we have a feminist, we have womanist, and all the other things. But the thing that is most upheld as a way of being in our country and in our world is whiteness. This way of being is not just different from the others, it is perceived as a best way of being in comparison to the others. It is that we commit more of our energy and our resources to upholding this way of being more than the others. When we build institutions and organizations, we build them using this as the foundation more than others. And because of that, this way of being is being held with a level of priority that none of the others hold. It is being held supreme. And because of that, the idea or act of upholding this way of being or this culture as a way of being above the other cultures, that is white supremacy. It's the notion that whiteness should be held in higher regard as a way of being in the world over every other way of being. So the thing about that is that this is not about anybody in a white hood. It's not about burning crosses on somebody's lawn. It doesn't have to, when we hear the words white supremacy and we tie it back to those old monikers of what it has to mean, we miss the opportunity to interrogate this structure, to examine and analyze the impact it is having on everybody, on everybody. And when it is being held as the central, core, and primary way of existing, that is what it means to prioritize whiteness. And that is all white supremacy is and does. It upholds whiteness as the most primary way of being in comparison to any other way of being for race, creed, color. Okay? So we want to take ourselves out of it so that we don't have to feel offended by the interrogation of whiteness. Because as long as it's like this, it feels like you're interrogating me. And now I have to defend it. I have to uphold. I have to protect, because you're not interrogating whiteness. You're not pushing back against whiteness. You're not railing against whiteness. You're railing against me. And because you're railing against me, I need to defend myself. But historically and intentionally, traditionally marginalized people groups, we never had the choice of whether or not we had to interrogate a way of being that was prescribed to us. Because the failure to interrogate it is to end up with trauma, triggers, low self-esteem, oppression. We always had to interrogate Blackness. And so we have a lot of practice interrogating this way of being and interrogating this way of being, because we didn't tie ourselves to these ways of being in this way. And my invitation to white people is to disconnect your you-ness from this social construct so that we can question and get curious about the social construct. And once we've done that, now let's put it back together and examine the extent to which we participate in that social construct. And arguably, that's everybody's work to do, because if you can hear my voice right now, you have the privilege to participate in whiteness. Any questions about what I've shared?
So I think I have a question, but I'm sort of struggling to formulate it properly. But I think, white culture, whiteness, assimilation, like these have for so long just sort of been how it is, right, in the United States. And so I think what would be helpful for me, at least in terms of trying to be critical of whiteness or white supremacy culture, would be to understand what the counterpoint to that even looks like. Because I'm not sure I even know, just because it's so embedded in just how this country has always functioned. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And so I can give you some examples, Sarah. If we started this meeting calling out the names of our ancestors who came before us, just let that sit with you for a second. And for some of us, that felt like a no-brainer. Like, well, sure, that, yes. That as regular as breathing is to you, whiteness is to you, what I just named as a way of opening up a meeting is like breathing for me. So now imagine that outside of the coffee shop, I can't tell you any times I start these meetings calling out the ancestors. If we get together as Black residents of Oak Park, that's where we always start, right? I want to think about time for a minute. If I showed up to the board meeting 12 minutes after 6, that would feel egregious to most of you, right? But in communities of color, they start their board meetings when everybody gets there, whenever that is. And that sounds preposterous to your ears, but there are people who this is the water they swim in. And they will finish whenever the last person has had their final say. I'll give you another example. Robert's Rules of Order. That just doesn't exist in certain places in the world. I spent time in Israel and Palestine, I think 2 years ago. And I was with some of my Jewish friends, and they have a tradition called machloket, where you can't even articulate your position or stance on something unless you can first give several key points about what is great about the antithesis point on the table. You got to talk about what you love about the thing that is opposing your thing before you can lodge your thing. These are ways of being. So hardly ever will you find me presenting from a PowerPoint presentation. PowerPoints is rooted in professional culture, which is rooted in whiteness. The last session, I started the session with song, right? In a board meeting, if that feels off, it's because it's not traditionally done in white culture. And I do those things because they're genuine and authentic to who I am. And I'm pretty apologetic about that. So, or unapologetic. And so when I do it, I am modeling what non-white culture could look like. And when we got on the call today, the first thing Gina said was, "Are we gonna have another one of those songs like you did last time?" Someone else was like, "Why is she playing these songs? This has nothing to do with the work at hand," right? So whiteness can be transactional, and it could be rooted in the getting to the end point. Non-white culture is more interested in the journey and the process and what we experience and build together on that journey. And I feel the angst in my shoulders and the discomfort of knowing when I show up and tell my stories and do my things, that there is a presence of whiteness that is experiencing discontent. So when people of color show up in non-white ways, it is literally a courageous act. When in white culture, I give to you, you take in or consume the thing I give you, and then you critique it. Consumption is a characteristic of whiteness. In my culture, I don't give to anybody. We sit around the table and create the giving together. And we all own it and we're all responsible for it. So if we hate it, that's even also on us. And so these are some distinctions. I appreciate your question, Sarah, like, how would I know what this even looks like? And we have names for things that are non-white. We call them unprofessional. Sometimes we call them inappropriate. Sometimes we call them a waste of time. Sometimes we say they're too expensive. Sometimes we say things like, well, we've never done that before. We lean into tradition as a way to combat non-white ways of being. And all of those things that I named, that is what keeps whiteness intact as the supreme way of being. So I'm not creating the language or the weightiness of the language. I think that that is also a part of whiteness, to ensure that we don't have the language to have the conversation. That if when I say white supremacist, you know, you're undone and now we can't have a conversation, and, you know, social media goes bananas, and really all white supremacy is upholding white ways of being over any other way of being. And that means probably that any one of us could be complicit in that behavior. Questions about that?
Thank you, that was helpful.
You are very welcome. Anybody else on that topic?
Yeah, yes, thank you as well for that, as well as the introduction or the prior dialogue. I know Gina provided to a few of us or the board a document that kind of provided additional, I don't know if it is descriptors of white supremacy culture. Gina, do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, it's the white supremacy culture document by Tema Akun that identifies the 9 traits of white supremacy culture and how they show up in spaces, and then the antidotes to those. Yeah, I shared those a while ago, I think.
Right. Yes, it's been a while. So, you know, that was helpful. Although, you know, as I look at them, I'd love to see them again. I don't have them in front of me, but I kind of was perplexed by some of it, which I think is part of the struggle of things that, from my perspective, we're kind of covering both sides, you know, it different perspectives. It's like both sides of the coin. And so I'd want to look at that and talk more of it. I really like what we just heard. So thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions or comments there?
Yeah, Rashida, just real quick, I want to, I appreciate you when we speak to ways of being, right? And upholding whiteness as a supreme way of being, acknowledging that it's not just white people who can show up, right, in that space, and that people of color who can, you know, who may not be aware can show up in those ways as well. So I thought that was something important to note.
Yes, and that, to be honest, like, because code switching necessitates people of color's ability to get in and out of whiteness.
Absolutely.
Our children know by the time they are in first grade, what is that, 6 years old, how to get in and out of whiteness, because their very lives depend on their capacity to do that. And there are people who knowingly and unknowingly leverage that in the same ways that white people do. That's why I think it's important to see whiteness as a social construct at this point, because there are all kinds of people who participate in the upholding of white supremacy. All right,
Rashida, yeah, so one more question, and this is unlikely to get answered quickly. So, I just one of the things that is curious that I feel when I see this, and you know, certainly I find myself in the whiteness bucket, and I find myself defending whiteness because you know, for obvious reasons, right? But there are elements of this culture you want to inspect and discuss, and there are elements of Blackness culture to inspect and discuss. But we so quickly, at least in my view, we so quickly get into judging those elements as good or bad in conversation, when that's not the point you're laying out there. There are just elements of these two different cultures. They are just different. And we can all choose which elements we like and we don't. And there should be nothing wrong with that. But then where it goes a little haywire is when we start judging those elements.
And or when the elements we choose are actually oppressing someone else, right?
Right.
So if I'm choosing something that I like as an element of Blackness that actually causes harm for someone else, then that's when you get social justice, where we're like, no, this cannot stand as a form of culture because it is oppressing another group. Those are the things we have to pull on as well.
Right, right. And I just think it's very easy. I'm sure if you are talking from within either bubble to get defensive about these things because people add value judgment to them very quickly, maybe without real understanding.
Yes, and to that point, Craig, one of the things that my firm does that we don't have a lot of non-negotiables, but this is one. It is to talk about the posture we hold when we do the work. So that before we start having these conversations about white values and Black values and brown values and all the things, we first need to examine how effective am I at having these conversations? What are my drivers when I have these conversations? What are my biases? Do I even know what they are? Because I can't manage it if I don't even know it's there. The other thing I will say is that if I have lived in privilege my entire life, and then someone comes and I'll give you an example. I was in Congo and I had my cell phone and I'm meeting people all over and resisting my privilege because in the world I'm in at that time, as a Black woman, I don't have privilege. So that's not a thing at that time in my mind is what I thought. So when I went to Congo, I was an American woman, right? And they're like, that phone that you have, it must be nice to have that. You know, my eyeglasses were indicators of privilege, right? And so I wanted to be offended. What do you mean? In my country, you know, in America, I'm not perceived as one who's privileged. And what I quickly came to understand is that it is more of a continuum than it is a binary. There's not this notion that either I have privilege or I don't, but rather that we're all on a continuum of privilege. So if that is true, then who I respond to, how, when, where, how much voice I get to amplify, how much power I get to have is relative to my context. So if I'm with a bunch of students in a classroom, I have to mind my privilege lest I participate in ageism. If I am at a boardroom table and it's all white men and I'm the only Black woman, I will assert myself quite comfortably because I'm the person who should be able to do the most saying in that space. And so rather than, so when we go, there is no cultural competency. There is only cultural agility because we're constantly moving on this spectrum of what is required. Right? So if I'm in the coffee shop and a white male comes in to ask me a question, but then doesn't listen to my answer because it was really just a lead in for him to say whatever he wanted to say, then that is a place where I am being the one who is oppressed. If I do the same thing to my 20-something all-female staff, now I need to be, you see?
Yeah.
But we've not traditionally thought about it as a nimble practice. You're either it or you're not. And the binary gets in the way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Anything else on this? Okay. Then I am going to ask you an overarching question, one that was most pervasive in the work we did together. And then I want you to take 3 minutes just to think about the question and how you might respond to it. And I can't put it in the chat, so I'm going to read it out loud a couple of times. I'm going to read it out loud, and then I just want you to take 3 minutes to process it. I will set a timer. So here's the question. In what ways is whiteness informing the very approach we are attempting in the administration of anti-racism training for the board? How has power, tradition, dominant cultural ways of being, how have they been informing the process? Why have they been informing the process? To what extent should they be informing the process? In what ways is whiteness informing the very approach we are attempting in the administering of racism, anti-racism training for the board? How has power, tradition, and dominant cultural ways of being been informing the process? Why? And to what extent should that be the case?
Excuse me, Rashida, do you want me to, I can share my screen and that question is a part of the board item. Would you like me to do that?
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I wasn't sure if I could share mine or not, so I just read it out loud, but thank you so much, Dr.
Can you
Pruitt.
see it? Can
Yes,
you see it as the primary overarching question?
yes. So let's take 3 minutes to ponder that question. I'm going to set a timer and we can come back in 3 minutes. All right. So everyone has had a few minutes to process. And we are now going to do a large group fishbowl, which means that everyone will stay together, but we will choose triads to engage a conversation around the question. So it's sort of a way to do small group discussions without leaving the group. LeVar, I have 3 groups of 3 on my end, unless you all have groups already created.
No, you can go ahead and tell us who the groups will be, and we can get started.
Okay, sounds good.
Could we stop screen sharing too for the group so we could see everybody? Is that possible? Or I don't know if that's necessary.
There you go.
Thank you.
All right. So group 1 is going to be Gina, Tom, and LeVar. Group 2 is going to be Jackie, Craig, and Ralph. And group 3 is going to be Matt, Sarah, and Joylyn. Okay. And so I'm just going to set a timer to make sure we don't go overtime. And you're going to engage in your own organic conversation related to the question, the overarching question at hand. And of course, I'm going to ask that Gina facilitate her group's conversation. You'll pay me back for that later, I'm certain.
I think I will probably. No, I don't mind at all. I appreciate the question. So I'm wondering the thoughts. Who's my group? LeVar and Tom?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm just curious the thoughts that what occurred for you around how has whiteness driven what we're doing. I don't want to jump in first. If either one of you would like to, that would be awesome.
I'll jump in.
And then we'll just go in that same order of sharing. So it'll be Tom, LeVar, and then me, if that's cool with the group.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I, you know, as I heard the question, what was shared in the last half hour on what non-white culture looks like, or that was extremely beneficial or helpful to me. So when I reflected on the question, just to start just thinking of it as a board, and you mentioned Robert's rules, I mean, the whole structure that exists, it is structure that was put together in a form, I mean, it's governance that was set up by white culture in a white way. And so we're starting at the very beginning, we're starting with rules and goals and agendas that are done or required for us to do training. Whereas Gina, I think, you know, at the beginning said, why can't we just, you know, have a few small groups? And what was the reaction is we have rules that don't allow us to do that. Now, those are rules of governance, et cetera. So that was my first reaction, and I'll pause at that point.
Yeah, and just to jump in, what you spoke to, Tom, specifically when I think about tradition, right? And to have the rules in place in order to even have the conversation is limiting for the conversation to happen, because we can't be split into groups and needing to, you know, think of other ways to do that. But even more so when I think about dominant ways of being, and we go all the way back to the civil rights movement, and even the notion of having conversations about race, right? Before that movement, it was socially permissible to, you know, hold racist ideologies, right? And then almost immediately after that, we're expected to now be in a post-racial society, and not to see color. Folks are being socialized to treat everyone the same and to shy away from the conversation itself. So I think with that being a dominant cultural way of being, just the fact of being able to have conversations about race and how it relates to leadership and so forth has been a hindrance. So that's what came up for me.
I appreciate what you both said, because it actually made me think about, yeah, I was thinking something very similar, Tom, about the Robert's rules and the order and the structure, and the same, LeVar, like that, how our constructs are over time. But actually what it made me think about was time. Like, you know, we've set this as an agenda item that our board is going to, you know, do this racial work And just in the framework that we do it in, that there's a beginning and an end to this work, when in actuality, it's like an ongoing thing. And then we also have the time constraint, which is, you know, we have only a certain amount of time during our meetings, but not just that, like there's an expectation of accomplishment, that this is some form of transactional work, that we're going to do this and then we're going to get it and then we're going to move on. And so I feel like that way of, you know, moving through things compartmentalized in a sense also feels like how dominant culture shows up.
Thank you. You all have 6 more minutes, so you can look at other components. Carry on, please.
Back to you, Tom.
So, and I'm in full disclosure, Gina, I've pulled up the characteristics that you had sent because that was helpful. So as I look at that again, it gives me something just to wrap my head against. And you just kind of hit on the one that kind of jumps out at me, which is that I don't know if it's called perfectionism. You know, it's about getting somewhere, right? And saying, okay, now we've done this, versus, and I love the way it was stated earlier about the journey. Okay, what is the journey? And I've been, you know, this is 8 years of snippets of discussion, so the journey's been very you know, hunt and peck, you know, one session here, one thing there, as a board. And I'm saying as a board, because it's been a challenge.
We'll stay in our same order, LeVar, so you'll be next.
Yeah, so and looking at the question, how has power, I want to talk about power and power dynamics for a second, right? And what, I think it was Dr. Moore who pinged something for me earlier when we talk about the allocation of resources, right? Whether they be human, financial, and what have you, to make sure that this conversation is ongoing work. So, you know, maybe I can't really articulate how I see or feel whiteness as a construct showing up in that realm, but I know there's a power dynamic in terms of being able to move things forward if in fact you are willing to do that. And that's something that needs to be interrogated and investigated if we do have the resources available. You know, what is in the way of pushing that work forward from a power standpoint and being able to make things happen.
Wow, LeVar, you made me think about, thank you so much for that, because you made me think about this, you know, that what I always talk about, which is othering and this power and control, like concepts of power and control, and how, you know, systemically, historically, there have been these levels of power and control and how they're exerted, and our training is actually somewhat set up in that same framework, because although we're you know, the board only has one employee, that's Dr. Pruitt-Adams, but there's still like those elements, like for me, to remove the element of power and control as like a dominant way of being means what we're doing right now, which is this discussion that actually starts to break down what our beliefs are, what we feel, so that we can actually have a conversation that will move things differently. So to me, the relationship piece is the key component to what we're doing across our, you know, administration, staff, and board, and, you know, all of that. And it would be awesome if we had a student here, I'm just saying. But if we had, you know, so that we're all in this collective conversation. And when I think of the dominant culture is not a collective function typically, unless it's like by the democratic vote. And like our way of even doing this, when we talk about like what we're going to talk about, who's going to be here, like, so all these little pieces of how all that power and control and dominance picks up, that is to me the opposite of how we do things collectively.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of just go off my head as I was listening to you, Gina. And that I was reflecting on I guess it's called my professional training. Okay. And there are certain norms in that training that I attributed to it's a quality culture. Okay. I grew up, that was the Deming philosophy, all these different things that you know, were all, if you look at it, it was about one right way to do things and a variety of things. And so, you know, those backgrounds, training backgrounds, et cetera, are what shapes me. Okay. And is the norm. And I've always named it quality. I've not named it whiteness. Okay. So, and actually it came out of, you know, I mean, I'm just using one thing. It came out of Japan. Okay. But regardless, I'm just reflecting on how, I'm not answering the question on him, but this is, you know, I'm more into a dialogue. I hope that's going to help me and us. So I just look at my own training, and there's many of these things that were just, it was the way we did things. And they're white norms. And I'll break there.
I think that's a good place to break, Tom. Your group's time is about to run out. Thank you all so much for what you've shared. Now we're going to build on that group of three, keeping in mind the question, and then whatever you process during your reflection time, introspection time. And then you can also use now the content that you have heard from your three colleagues, as Jackie, Craig, and Ralph go next for 10 minutes. And Ralph serves as Ralph, can you see all of us?
Yeah, I can see all of you, but like I said, I've been having technical difficulties, so you are all frozen, and some of you with very nice facial expressions, and some with more interesting.
Duly noted. Duly noted. We will have Craig facilitate your group. Jackie, Craig, and Ralph for 10 minutes. Go for it.
Craig, you're
Can you?
muted.
Craig, you're muted.
Phrase of 2020. Yes. Thank you. So in facilitating the group, I guess, Ralph, you want to jump in first, or Jackie?
Sure, the faceless wonder will jump in first. You know, one of the first things that occurred to me is the same thing that occurred to Tom, and that is the entire structure of our meetings is dictated by statute for the most part. So, you know, in these statutes and in these structures, we know that there is a lot of white culture just systemically embedded, and I would say that dictates how we operate. But I think the point that I really wanted to make, and Gina, I think you got to this a little bit, but I really think when you do any kind of racial work in our society, you have to acknowledge there really is no beginning and end. You have to keep at it. There's just no way to unpack the different levels of historic and or institutional supremacy, white supremacy, in the various public policy structures that we have. And the one we deal with most immediately, of course, is education in general and D200 in specific. So always being aware that you are on a journey that doesn't have a set beginning or a set end, but you're always looking for insights to enhance your, in our case, to enhance the educational experience for all of our students, irrespective of their race, means that you have to constantly be willing to deal with issues of race and look for barriers and or institutional ways children of color have been, Gina, I'm going to borrow one of your words again, othered or felt not included or welcomed in your system. And so I do think that that's a big part of it.
Uh-oh, did we
I
lose?
think you got knocked off.
We just
Yeah,
lost him.
you got knocked
Okay.
off, I think.
All right. Jackie, would you like me to go or would you like to go?
I'm fine with going, Craig, since you're the facilitator,
Okay.
so you can bring us home.
All right.
In listening to Ralph, one of the prior discussion, and also just reflecting on these questions, something that sticks out for me is that when we were talking about race or anti-racism or whiteness or white supremacy culture or white privilege in the context of our meetings, and indeed it's even in our community, not just board, but in our community, I'm always struck by the hesitancy. I don't know if it's hesitancy. Don't want to ascribe what I observe is that the white people on our board or in meetings outside of this, but I will stick with our board, want to go slow and have questions about, well, what is this going to mean? And the feelings part and the relationship building and the trust part, I wonder sometimes how we're defining that individually, because to be in these spaces, and I appreciate now, Craig, even you saying, Jackie, would you like me to go first? As I am taking that as a point of learning, and that you've heard me, that it's uncomfortable to talk about race when, as a Black woman, speaking up first because of discomfort or hesitancy or fear of saying the wrong thing. And, I'm even noticing tonight as we're talking that there are generalities. I think Tom broke through that, which was refreshing, and I'm not surprised because I've been watching Tom for a while, to kind of take it to a personal level, and that's hard, and it's hard for me as a Black woman to not share my experiences, because there's certain things that trigger things that have happened, and even in the boardroom or amongst our board, or experiences from 40, 50 years ago that can be brought back by something that's said or disbelieved or whatever it is. So, I've had to learn to, I feel guarded in how I respond at times, because I don't want to be dismissed. And I also don't want to be viewed as, there she goes again, because it's exhausting. So the more that I can understand and learn the perspective, the experiences, even, do it afraid, even if it feels scary to hear from my white colleagues what their experiences are and how they're interpreting, the work that we're doing. Because even the question that Rashida asked earlier of, the white members of the board, that time was spent qualifying and dissecting the question, and no one kind of leapt in, and then the time was up. And that's one of the issues with, things like this. But it was noticeable, and it wasn't new that there's a hesitancy, and I'm not quite sure how we push through that.
Thank you, Jackie. Ralph, you are back among us.
Yeah, that's a great way to get someone to stop talking. Just cut them off and bounce them out of the meeting. So yeah, that worked very effectively. Like,
yeah, the button right there. Yeah. So.
Standpoint.
All right.
But, I apologize. My internet's been going in and out all day. I don't know if it's the weather or what, but I've had a really bad technology day.
So I wanted to add some things here to what I've heard, and I hope, I don't know if they're constructive, but I've always struggled a little bit with this well, we talked about constructs. Let's start with that. Constructs that of whiteness that we live by, and frankly, you can go all the way back to the pure fact that we have a board that's elected by folks as being a whiteness construct. I think in other cultures, that construct could be done quite differently. It could be done by a council of elders. It could be done by a community. It could be done in lots of ways. So our whole construct is constructed in whiteness. And I guess I wanted to add to something that, to me, it's interesting that I try not to, and I understand why we do, but to me it's really a construct of power and not power, and that can be whiteness and blackness. It can be Americanness and Europeanness. It can be any construct back and forth, and it's all us being aware that those constructs exist to try to do a better job at respecting what all those different elements count. It's not just whiteness and blackness. Now, I understand white supremacy. I understand why we think about it that way, and I can totally agree with that. But I also think of it as more dynamic. And the reason I wanted to say that was, for me, as Jackie was reflecting on, being guarded, the last couple of years I've been hugely guarded all the time because I don't necessarily understand all the different cultures that I'm among, whiteness, blackness, and the pieces of those, and being afraid to say things that could possibly offend, or not even offend is the wrong way, just be, oppress, to do anything to impact those other pieces. And that's where I've struggled the most over the last couple of years. Is this helps a lot to understand that dynamic, but it's also I'm struggling with how to work through that dynamic. So anyway, that's my thought. So I don't know, Rashida, are we up? Is our time up? Okay.
Right to the nose, Craig, right to the nose.
Okay.
The last group we will hear from, and then we will put it all back together again in a conversation for a little bit. Let's hear from Matt, Sarah, and Joylyn, and Sarah will be the facilitator for this round.
Sure, happy to. So Matt, would you like to go first?
No, but thanks for asking.
Okay. Would you go first?
For me?
Or are you passing? I just want to clarify.
No, I'll be happy to talk at some point, but I'm still listening and learning.
Okay. Joylyn? I can go first if, whichever.
I'm gonna say I'll be the Black woman who speaks first. I just think the educational system, as it is structured, was built on the concept of whiteness. Our board meetings, all of those things that we do every day, from board policy to board decisions and interactions, were built from a white culture. And so when you talk about dismantling that, there's a sense of loss and a sense of fear that surfaces. If we reflect on some of our board meetings where when there's a community push, sometimes I think the community push is that fear of, sometimes we say change. I think it's a fear of loss, of giving up something that has been held on for such a long time, and that fear of unknowing. When I listen to our board, particularly today, I've heard a lot. I've heard more openness today and shedding of some of that culture, or either opening themselves up to be receptive and to hear, to really hear and absorb and really want to learn that I have not seen before. Um, and that happens a lot in white culture. We will we will hear that there's a desire for change. We will hear that I don't know. We will hear it's hard for me to understand. We will hear I am uncomfortable. And then, as Dr. Moore said, then we are perceived as, particularly Black women, because we have the two things come, we're Black and we're female. So we easily get labeled with the angry Black female label. But we as a culture, like Rashida talked earlier about culture, we as a culture learn by talking, by doing, by sharing. And so, and at the core of everything we do is for people to really understand who we are and what we are made of. And sometimes that is received as anger, that is received as pushy, instead of being received as see me for who I am, see me as an equal. And I think there's a fear, and I don't even know if it's a conscious fear that exists when that happens. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Pruitt-Adams, for sharing that. So Matt, I'll go next unless you would like to go.
No, you can go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. So this question, I think, sort of gets at the whole, I like this question because I think it really gets at the issue, right? So for example, for the question of, how are we taking, the entire question was, how are we, the very approach we're taking in administering the anti-racist training, like how is whiteness informing that process? And I think for me, it's very much like I sort of, as I dissect it, I'm thinking of it as like a class, right? Like I'm literally taking notes and I've got sort of like my little notebook and I'm trying to like learn as much as I can. But the reality is I think that that's just sort of like a white way of approaching things, right? Like I'm gonna understand it, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna get it, I'm going to, when of course it's not, like that's not it at all, right? It's just sort of my way of trying to navigate. And clearly it's like a very sort of white dominant way of doing things, right? So I feel as though we really treat the board equity professional development, I mean, even just the name professional development, right? Like that in and of itself is a white construct. So I think that if we were trying to be maybe truer, I mean, for example, when Gina does her CCB, which I don't know that everyone's had the opportunity to participate in, but CCB is like a very different structure in terms of how it flows than any other board meeting or board anything I've ever done. Because it's so much more relational, right? And so I think that the perhaps even the way we've just been approaching professional development is sort of further in like compounding the issue. And I obviously will take responsibility for that as well. So I'll stop there. I mean, I feel like there's a bunch of pieces to this question, but I will stop there for now because I feel like I'm just going on and on. So Matt, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure, where to add or to chime in here. I've been listening and learning all along the way. And so I'm not sure if there's any prompt specifically within this overall part of the agenda that maybe would be helpful. I'm not really quite sure where my comments might lie.
Rashida, if you wouldn't mind, I don't want us to run over. How much time do we have left?
We have 13 minutes before we do the final conversation around tangible practical application.
Okay, so I'm not sure so how much time do we have left for the three of us, or is?
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
3.5 minutes.
Oh, 3.5 minutes left. Okay. So Dr. Pruitt-Adams, I don't want to, you lead us in so many things. I don't want to make you kick this off. But I do feel like there are other sort of pieces to the question. And so I don't know if we want to maybe address some of those, Dr. Pruitt-Adams, if you'd be interested, or Matt, I'm happy to.
You mean the other questions that were on the agenda or just?
Like the sub questions, right? One of them was, what are the collective goals for the training? And what are existing barriers to relationships? And are we ready for anti-racism, equity, and equity training?
I am, this is a safe space, right? Where I should be able to speak my truth. And I am in a strange place right now because the questions as you just framed them with, are we ready? What do we need to do? And all of that. When a few minutes ago, I said I was pleased at the openness and the receptivity. And I have to say, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, Mr. Barron, but you didn't do that. You were hesitant. And I just think for the group as a whole to be really able to jump in and dive and really come out of this and commit to the training, we all have to be willing to share. And I know it's difficult, but and I don't know, I'm just, and all I could think was, wow, white supremacy culture.
So thank you for that prompt. I'm sorry, Dr. Pruitt.
Yeah, but that's the first thing that went to my head.
Thank you for being so honest. That took a lot of courage. So that is something that is on my mind, actually, is this whole construct of white supremacy culture versus people being called white supremacists. And that's a concern I have, is that in this space, there's intelligent discourse where people will say and use terms that are literally the terms to use to describe systems of oppression and white supremacy culture. And then out there in this community and in the world, but specifically in this community, there's people who are referring to me and to a number of white elected officials in the last 12 hours, 8 hours, as white supremacists. And so it goes from an intelligent, nuanced conversation in this space to that kind of unfortunate rhetoric in other spaces. And in those spaces, I gotta believe there's people who know better, who can speak into that space with credibility, people of color in particular. And I don't see that happening, unfortunately. I see people who know better and can call out over-the-top expressions of defamation, and it's not happening. And so that's a disappointment that I have in general and with specific people in this community. And that's something that I think would be helpful, whether it's in this space now or in some other space later, to really examine that there's people who are, through their silence and with positions of credibility and power, who aren't saying, you know, I don't think it's helpful. And beyond, I think that's a minimum thing to say, to call A, B, C, D, E white supremacists. So that's my 2 cents.
I have a question by way of facilitation. One of the things that has been happening is that we've been inching, and I believe Gina talked about this earlier, we've been inching toward being more direct in how we communicate about whatever we're communicating about. And I think that that's helpful to the work because then it's concretized, right? Like it becomes more touchable, more malleable so that something can be done with it. And so I just want us to get curious about the extent to which we participate in tangible, practical, courageous conversation. Because if it's passive aggressive or shrouded, then it becomes more enigmatic. And it's difficult to get your hands around it, to do something with it as a board. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to point out as the facilitator is that there is so much work that needs to be done within this board of directors and board of trustees that I'm curious about how we've jumped from there to like the bigger, larger context of what happens out there, especially when we only have 2 hours to be responsive to what's already here. And so 2 things I would say, let's communicate directly, because I think if we're really going to be in neutral space, as Mr. Barron talked about, the way that we hold neutral space is by holding that tension, but being direct in what we communicate, much like what Dr. Pruitt-Adams just did. So that's one. And then 2, if we can focus our time and attention on what's happening with this board, I think that would be plenty, because this is a heavy conversation and it becomes quickly convoluted when we invite the bigness of the elephant that is racism in Oak Park and beyond. Any questions about that?
Question, can you hear me? I don't really have a question, Ms. Graham Washington, but I do want to, I appreciate Matt having his voice in this space, and because, you know, I advocate for everyone's voice to be in the space, and that concern. When I think about being in circle, what I think about is, and I'm not saying that we're in circle right now, but it's just my way of being. So when I think about us being in that way, it means that everybody's voice is recognized and heard, right? And Dr. Pruitt-Adams expressed what she felt, and then Matt expressed what he felt. For me, everybody having the opportunity to say that, yes, absolutely. And to your point, what I appreciate is 2 things that's coming up for me, like about dominant culture. First of all, is that, okay, so can we just stay on task to what we need to talk about? Because what we need to talk about is what's here. And to me, that has a little bit of that dominant culture aspect to it, because it's like, we need to accomplish our task here. Our task here is for us. When I really clearly feel that all that's transpiring in the community is impacting this, our board, as well as the actions as we move forward, the staff in the building, the students in the building, right? So there's some element of not calling out as a cultural way of being. I don't believe in calling out, but there is a way of being able to acknowledge that calling in and that being necessary. And what I heard Dr. Pruitt-Adams, what I felt, I'm just going to speak for myself, what I felt from what Dr. Pruitt-Adams said was a calling into a way of being in conversation about how are we going to, like, each own our part for this. And to me, that's what's most important about our work here. That's what's most important about our work here. Like, I would be lying if I said that I'm not bringing everything that I've experienced over the past, you know, however long. Like, I already had a tirade at the last board meeting, so I won't go on and on, but I just feel like, and actually it wasn't really a tirade, it was an honest expression of what my experience has been. And what I'm hoping is that as we dig deeper together, that we don't get too task-oriented about this work. That we don't look at it, like Sarah said, as the, you know, I got my notes now, I'm good to go. But we look at it as, wow, there's a whole conversation happening that we're, as leaders in this community, we have the opportunity to call in to declare how we want to move in our spaces. Like, we get to do that. And I feel like, because our board, I don't know any other boards that are doing what we're doing right here. I don't think they are in the public way that we're doing it. And I feel like we're modeling to an extent how that can be done. And I want us to continue to do that.
Thank you, Gina. I think the narrative building that happens in our lives in this community, who owns the narrative of what something is or what it should be? I mean, just to speak directly, the narrative of what happened the last few months with my letter to the editor, and then last month with the board denouncing the statement. That narrative was a narrative alien to what I know, because I was the one who wrote the letter. And so in this community, people with whatever objectives, politically, locally, beyond, there's this battle for narrative. And that's fine. But when fiction enters into it and people are making up just wholesale untruths about just factual stuff is not part, to me, that's very dangerous and it's leading us down a path where we've seen nationally, where there's these different realities of why people did something, why someone is challenging someone's candidacy, or in this case, what my letter meant, and was it Islamophobic, was it racist? And this board made a decision a month ago to believe a narrative that I don't share. And so I agree, Gina. I think you're spot on that we have a position. All people, especially in public spaces, have a potential leadership opportunity to speak into the overall dialogue and the overall way that we treat one another in this community. And so I appreciate your saying that, yeah, the traditional model of getting through our agenda, which I guess comes from whiteness culture, is something that, wherever we may want to go with this, but so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Matt. I want to, in the spirit of holistic integrative practice, name that because the board is not settled in its way, it is very difficult for the consultant to know what way we're going. So when I have to run my agenda up the pipeline 5 times, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a whole lot, put tweaks in language and changes in form and minutes and things like this, you micromanage your process into deep whiteness. And then when it shows up, the other members of the board who don't want to participate in that call out the whiteness and say, oh, I hope that we're not going to, I just want you to understand the position that you're putting. This is not about Rashida. The truth of the matter is we all belong to the same community if I take my professional hat off for 2 seconds, right? But when I put my professional hat on, my job is to objectively mirror back to you what I see. And what will happen is a couple of things. One, the facilitator of your way forward does not stand a chance, because I would never write this. I would never write this experience this way. You understand? There are elements of what RGW does in this thing, but now it has like 3 heads and like 6 arms because it has had to contort itself. And then the feedback will be this from one half, and this from the other half. And when you have a circle and half of it says one thing and the other half says something else, what you have is the maintenance of status quo. It's a flat line. That's what you have. So I want to give that back because it creates a multiplicity headiness for your facilitator, and it chops them off at the ankles. And as a community member, I think it's important for me to talk to my community and say when that's happening, aside from my work as the consultant. Okay. Dr. Moore.
I just have to say that I appreciate you bringing that into this discussion. because a lot of what we've, been talking about in terms of how long, I know that the, 8 years I've been on the board, there have been attempts at least once, twice a year to engage a facilitator to have these types of discussions. And what you just described is what has prevented all of them from traction, because there is that narrative of, is the board ready for this? Is this too much? We don't want to upset the community. Well, we want to talk about this, but we don't want, I'm not sure they're ready. So even at the last minute, I've had, when I was in the role of working on these agendas, the agenda changing because someone got concerned that it was going to be upsetting to white board members. And it has stalled our work in so many ways that I appreciate you saying that, because until we're ready to trust the experts to be expert in what we have engaged them to do and not put our own agenda around that, we're going to continue to say, this is a good idea, we need to do this, let's get started. And we keep getting started. And I probably my tagline will be, "We burning daylight," because we've done this a lot, and we keep coming back to this same, we need to do this, but we won't trust who we've asked to shepherd us through the process to actually do that. And I don't know how that happens. I would love to know what RGW, what this looks like when you do it like you do it.
I was just going to say, Dr. Moore, thank you for saying that, because the constraints that we're doing this, I'm so glad that you asked us that question, Ms. Graham-Washington, because the asking of that specific question of how we're upholding this process with whiteness and white dominant culture, and actually white supremacy culture, right? Because what I want to acknowledge is the right to comfort aspect of it. And what Jackie just said just made me think about right to comfort. And we spend a lot of time. This board has experienced me have a highly emotional outbreak in one of our sessions, because I could not have to maintain how I speak, what I say, and what I do to maintain the comfort level for the group. And I think we have to be, I feel like sometimes we just we won't get to it. And I want us to get to it so bad. And and what Tom shared earlier, and his growing, and that is, to me, that if we could just have that conversation had been our whole conversation tonight, that was to me an example of okay, we are digging in. We're digging in. It doesn't feel good, but we're digging in. And there was a level of vulnerability that was so amazing to watch. And that's where I'm hoping that we'll go, right? Because all I care about is what we're building. I just don't have time. I just don't have time. I don't have time for us to talk about what we kept doing, because clearly we kept doing it. Jackie, 8 years, every time you say that, 8 years you've given to this, 8 years, every time you say it, my heart, I don't know if I could do 8 years of this. I don't. And what I'm hoping is we have 4 months, what do we have? It's into January, February, March. We got 2 or 3 more months together with each other. How do we develop something that could be a start, a jumping off point for our next group, for our next superintendent, for our next iteration? We have to be different. We have to be. And we're still upholding the norms. We're still upholding the norms. And we have to stop doing that. And it seems so easy to say we just have to stop doing that. But then when we say let's stop doing that, then we don't actually stop doing that. So I just would love for that to be the case at some point. Let's just all just get really uncomfortable and say a bunch of things that we really don't want to say, and be vulnerable, and demonstrate to our community that, hey, you know, we can have this conversation. We can, and we can actually listen to each other and do it at a personal level versus what Ms. Graham Washington was saying about versus doing it at the larger outer level. Because my concern about the larger outer level is I don't have a sphere of influence in the same way that we have a sphere of influence in this group about what happens to the students in the Oak Park and River Forest High School, which is why I ran for the board in the first place. So I want our sphere of influence to get vulnerable and together and willing. And even what Matt said was vulnerable to an extent. It's just we got to like let discomfort be okay. It's got to be okay. Okay, I'm done.
Can I jump in?
Please, Tom.
So, yeah, Jackie and I both share 8 years, and I know her 8 years is different than my 8 years, although we've enjoyed each other for that 8 years. And I as I was thinking about tonight, we talked about, it's only been in the last 2 years that we've really been, in my mind, talking about white supremacy culture, or some of that as an entity. Okay, lots of readings, lots of other things, but I've seen it change. Not quick enough, but I do see that the dialogue has changed, and I really appreciate what the insights brought to the earlier part of this dialogue. So that's my one comment I wanted to make. Is it fast enough? Never. The second point, I just want to reflect on on what Matt was saying, which is, to me as a group, which is the difference between racist behavior and labeling as a racist, between white supremacy behavior and labeling as a white supremacist. So I will say that I know as a nation that we have dominant white supremacy culture. I will state that it's evident and it is ugly. Okay. I will also state that I myself have grown up in that world and have acted in alignment with that. So that's and frankly, I'm not proud of it. Okay, I'm proud of who I am, but as I learn more, but being then labeled, if I were to have been labeled a white supremacist, which is, and I think, Gina, you've talked about that. It's the difference between the verb, right, and the noun. It's a different way of working together. I truly believe, as I look at my board members who have all committed their time to serve our students, that there's not one person in this group who is racist, okay, who is a racist, okay. I believe, I know I have racist pieces to me because that's my being. So, but I think it's important. I know that's a sore spot with me, is talking about the behaviors versus being labeled. So I just wanted to talk that.
Anyone else want to share? I have an observation that I heard. Sarah asked a question way back when we were talking about whiteness, and Sarah said, "Well, what does non-white culture, like? What are the elements of that? What does that look like? Like, what are the components of that?" That was Sarah's question, and then Ralph talked about the priority of the board being enhancing the educational experience, right? Then Dr. Pruitt-Adams talked about how people of color, particularly Black people, learn by talking, by doing, by sharing, right? So and this is, we have to move from this place where everything feels like an indictment and really start to think of it as us interrogating our practice. So if we struggle to determine what non-whiteness looks like, and our goal is to enhance educational experiences, but we don't know what non-white ways of being looks like in educational experiences, and if because of that, we don't create opportunities to learn by talking, doing, sharing, then there are not as many opportunities to learn for some of our students. And that, friends, is the essence of the opportunity gap. You see, you wove it together yourselves in your dialogue tonight. And it has nothing to, it has less to do with all of a sudden with test scores, tests that were created for white people, right? It has less to do with the number of books or pencils or pens. If we literally don't understand what non-white culture looks like, and that informs the enhancement of education experiences for some of our students, then we're debilitating their capacity to maximize their opportunities. That's the reason why I'm like, how do we start to shift towards practical application? How do we make this more holistic and integrative a journey? You just named the reasons why in that little trilogy. Questions, comments, thoughts about that?
That was really helpful. Thank you for sort of like amalgamating it that way. That helps me understand sort of better. I mean, one of the questions that was in the overarching question was, you know, what is our collective goal for the training, right? And I think that we probably have a common collective goal, certainly, right? And which is what Ralph articulated, to have our students have a better learning experience. But I think it'd be super helpful. I know, I mean, I know it's 7:45, right? But that issue, right, in and of itself, right? Like, how do we create these opportunities? What do these opportunities even look like? Would be a great sort of topic for our next conversation. And I hate, again, that we're still sort of like what Tom called it, like hunting and pecking, but like so segmented in our approach. And I would love to better know how to not be so segmented in our approach, right? Like how we can create that holistic vision, what that would look like, how that would sort of manifest itself. You know, that to me is just sort of the heart of it. So anyway, so thank you very much for sort of stringing that together. It was really good.
Any other final comments on this? We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to get to some tangible, practical application. We're kind of already.
Thank you.
Gina?
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for, you know, just pulling that all together for us. Thank you.
All right. Back. So now I want us to take about 4 minutes to think of some natural next best steps. They can be ones that have already been shared. They can be personal, individual ones. They can be for the collective of the board. What are the, and let's try to shy away from, this is what I would like to see, but all the things we can't do. What is the actual natural next best step we can take individually and or collectively on this anti-racism journey? Let's take 4 minutes and we'll come back and discuss that. All right, everyone, we have 10 minutes left in our discussion about tangible, practical application. What is the next natural next best step we can take as it pertains to our equity journey ahead?
I have one suggestion, and it's something I've thought about. Well, I got two. I was going to make one a future agenda item, but I'll throw it out here now. One is something that Gina talked about that, I've been talking about since I got on the board, but it stalled, and that is our student leadership at the table. And SAFE, that organization was a step in that direction when we had students, presenting to the board and influencing and, developing policy. So I think that's a step in terms of how if we're going to walk the walk of, best interests of our students and understanding what they need, particularly our Black and Brown students who are suffering to a large degree from feeling and being misunderstood from a cultural and experiential standpoint in a lot of ways. And the other is that has to do with CCB and a way of having that experience be transmitted to our board. And I'm talking more, we get updates about the recommendations that CCB has made, but there is so much richness in the circles that happen in the beginning and what is learned and shared. And it's, open meetings, so it's not, but there's a trust there where our students in particular and our community members share experiences, and we're all on the same level. So there's no hierarchy at all. And I'm just wondering if that would be something that even our board members, if we could somehow commit to participating in that circle, if we're not having it at, and I may be overstepping, Gina, so you can always tell me as chair that that's not a good idea, but just some way of being connected with our staff and community and students is very different than our traditional board meetings.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. Anyone else?
I guess I like to build on what Jackie said. I think there's a really good element in there. I'll just express a little bit as I reflected on this question. And I'll just be honest, this conversation has been very good, great, and a good necessary thing. But if I put myself in the seat of one of our students listening to us have this conversation, I am so disappointed in us as a group of adults. And so the thing I said was, okay, so what one thing can we do from the middle that doesn't involve using, that shows us and our students that we care about these issues that impact them? And then maybe Jackie's idea, I can build on that and say maybe we should have a joint meeting with CCB, with students, and just listen to the issues that come out of that in that group a little bit better. So that's my thought.
I would like to also offer the opportunity. We have a group called the Student Leaders Group, and we meet once a month. And they talk about issues as well. And most of those students are on CCB as well. So they serve a twofold purpose. We would love to have one or two members of the board even, can't have three, but one or two members of the board to be a part of that group. It's a phenomenal group of students. They talk about everything from the cell phone policy to the racial equity policy to you name it, they talk about it. And they run those meetings. And it would be great if we had a board rep who was a part of that.
I love that, Dr. Pruitt-Adams. I feel like I recall that that was a thing that was an ask before, and they meet right after school, right? I think that was the thing. I also wanted to say, I really love what Jackie said about like folks coming to CCB. You know, Dr. Moore, you can always overstep with me. You know, like I feel like that was not even an overstep. That was just appropriateness. I would love to see that connection happen. You know, because we really do have the conversations that we're having at CCB are change driving conversations that are impactful, like human wise. I don't know another way to say that. But the actual experience of the students are part of the conversation in a way that makes us think about doing things very, very differently. And you don't hear that in our meeting, because our meeting is a lot of reports and stuff. I also, when the first thing, when you said, what is the next first logical step? My immediate thought was that each of the board members do a one-on-one with another board member. That was my immediate thought. Was like, I know that there have been times that we've all made attempts to connect with one another one-on-one so that we could like get to know each other, but I think that would be a valuable exercise. And I'm saying that for a couple of reasons. Even though I know there's only a few months left for some folks on the board who may not be coming back, and that makes me sad. But I still think that that if we get connected to each other, there's going to be a different level of understanding of why we have the discussion this way, why my viewpoint is such, why I explain it that way, all of those things. So that's, I felt as a first natural thing. And then the other piece was for us to get very specific about what does our own personal work, I've said this before, but what does our own personal work have to do with how we drive agenda and change and for equity? Because that personal work piece is important and ongoing. So I don't have a policy piece in mind or anything like that, but yeah.
Paris.
Oh, I knew I was forgetting something. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I know that we engage the community in a number of ways, and I know that the community council is one of those ways. I know that, you know, there's different parent groups that meet that are certain ways, and I'm not trying to add more meetings to anybody's schedule because we all already have a lot. But I wonder how we engage, not in the same old ways that we do, of how we do it, but is there another way, another more relational, deeper understanding of how the system, the question you asked us tonight, Rashida, asking that question in all of our other spaces that are connected to the high school and all the organizations that are connected to the high school.
Yeah. So Gina, if I could jump in there, this is Ralph. You know, Gloria Letts and Billings learned a lot about best educational practices by talking to the parents of Black and brown kids and finding out what made them excited and their kids excited about learning, and what practices teachers had that got their kids engaged in education. So I think finding a way to utilize an effective outreach to parents of our kids who are Black and brown, and getting their input on what they have found positive and what they have found negative, and what their children have found positive and negative in their experience at OPRF would be a really good way to gain some insight on how we can move forward from a policy standpoint and from a system standpoint to make things better.
I'm going to jump. I don't know. I can't say. Can I?
Go for it, Tom.
So I'm going to be kind of, I think it weaves around, but in the last few weeks, I don't know. I've reread, Jackie, the 2003 report, the Learning Community Performance Gap Report. And it was a good kick in the head. You know, I think you know, some of the things that have been discussed here, Jackie's, you know, persistence of student involvement. I mean, it's in this, it was presented 17 years ago. And so this is the way I look and say, okay, we're not the first ones talking about this. Jackie and I have had 8 years that there's been, you know, it's this report outlined it was well dug into, it outlined what the issues are in our community. And so my action was to reread it. And then the question is what, you know, and I'm, you know, from a positive standpoint, there's a couple seeds that are in there that it took 16 or 15 years to germinate, but they've started. So that's, you know, there's a ray of hope. And thanks to the leadership of Dr. Pruitt-Adams and others, okay? But it's in this book. So, and it talks about many of the things that have been brought up. So my action is to read the thing and read it again and say, okay, why can't we, what do we need to do? Because we don't need to reinvent what was done here. Although I would say our knowledge and learning on culture continues to blossom. So, but it was even mentioned, I mean, that was the theme behind a lot of it 17 years ago. I just never read it that good.
All right, friends.
Can I add a thing? I'm sorry.
Add a thing.
Add a thing. I really would like for us to look at having a systemic ethnic studies program in the high school. And the reason how that relates to our board, I think, is because the education that we receive from K-12 is critical in how we form our assumptions about people. And historically, it comes from a conversation with my daughter. I'll be specific, I know we're at time. But she said, Mom, how come there are no honors African-American history courses, but there's honors English courses, honors all those other courses? She's like, where's my honors course about African history or honors course about Mesopotamia, you know, any of the places that had people of color or brown-skinned people. And so if there was a way for us to begin to have a conversation about how do we really, what would that look like for us to have not only ethnic studies as a whole full, all 4-year content, but as well as like advanced ethnic studies courses. What does that look like in a high school?
Better not let anybody write that coursework without me. I'll go anywhere. I'll do it. I taught at the high school. It would be my life's dream to have taught these courses when I was there. Yeah. All right, I have compiled that list. I saw many of you writing. I know you did too, but I will craft this up and send it back to you in a report. I appreciate the ways in which you have stretched yourself and also allowed me to be both a professional and a community member, because it's the only way I know how to show up anyway. So thank you all for that. And yeah, I think that onward and upward. Onward and upward. Thank you all so much for making the time tonight. And I look forward to sharing these final reflections and tangible next steps with you.
Ms. Graham Washington, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Wait, we have to adjourn.
Oh, yes. So
So
moved.
We need to
So moved.
You
I'm
also
sorry.
got rid of Robert's Rules of
Second,
Order
second.
tonight.
Yeah.
I don't want
I
Gail to
move.
be mad.
I second, and we almost always get rid of Robert's Rules of Orders at the Culture, Climate, and Behavior Committee because I always forget to do that. Gail's like, wait.
I don't want Gail mad at us.
All right, I think the ayes have it. So thank you everyone for your work tonight, and thank you, Ms. Graham Washington. That was really lovely.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.